Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Rapid Response in Missing and Abducted Children Cases, Identifying and Managing Sex Offenders. My name is Carissa Rano, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those of you wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. The certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks at OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us. I will now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Melissa Blazing.
Thank you, Carissa, for that introduction. As Carissa mentioned, my name is Melissa Blazing, and I am the Region 2 Liaison with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. The Amber Alert CTA program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar as part of our Amber Alert webinar series. In conjunction with our mission, this series works to bring together state, local, and tribal subject matter experts to present and discuss critical issues related to missing, abducted, and exploited children. To learn more about the Amber Alert program, our training and technical assistance opportunities, and to view past webinars, please visit us at www.ncjtc.org/AmberAlert. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to submit your questions via the Q&A box located on your screen, as we will answer these questions at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce and turn today's presentation, Rapid Response in Missing and Abducted Children Cases, Identifying and Managing Sex Offenders, over to our presenter and subject matter expert, Derek Van Luschen. Derek?
Hey, thanks, Melissa. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're at in the fine country. If you're on the West Coast, it would still be morning, I guess. But thanks for joining us today for this presentation. And again, it's an honor for me to be able to bring you this information and spread the word about what we do through the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program, and also through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Like Melissa said, my name is Derek Van Luschen. I'm a consultant with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. I've been with them on and off for since about 2005 is when I started helping them put programs together. And in addition to that, just a little bit about my past is I was in law enforcement. I started in law enforcement in a small community in northern Montana in 1990, and from there I went to the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, where I was an agent from 1998 till 2008, when I got out to consult full-time and also start a nonprofit organization. My family's nonprofit is called Ryan United. Ryan United is a nonprofit located in Montana, but we do a lot of work around the country with victims of crime, specifically children that have been sexually abused and their families, to bring them resources. Also, we train law enforcement on sex offender awareness, sex offender management issues, and also communities. We get into a lot of communities to do those presentations as well. Ryan United was formed by my family in memory of my brother, Ryan. who was 8 years old when he was abducted out of our backyard. Ryan went out at 10:30 in the morning to play on August 31st, 1987. He was there 1 minute and gone the next. We looked for Ryan for about a day and a half before his body was recovered. But before they found his body, they questioned a man in the community who had just been released from prison about 90 days before Ryan's disappearance. This person had been in our Montana State Prison for sexually molesting other kids. He was convicted in 1984 of sexually molesting a 13-year-old boy at knife point. He was put into prison for that crime and got out. He was sentenced to 5 years for that crime. He got out in 3. He got out for good behavior. They put him back into the community with no notification. So he was back in the community and immediately started to look for his next victim, and that's when he found my little brother playing in our backyard that day. So as you can probably guess, as a family, we were not only devastated, but also we were determined to do more to make sure that offenders are not only held accountable, but also that we have things in the community that when we let these offenders out, that we just don't let them out. And we just don't not tell the community and not inform law enforcement. So we've come a long way since my brother was taken from us, and we've legislated in this state and also other states on how important it is to have programs in place. And I'll talk about some of those programs in the presentation today that are vital for community protection, because when it comes to sex offenders, it's up to us and law enforcement and our professions to have safety nets to make sure when they get out that there's things that they can go to and programs that they can go to so they don't reoffend. And that takes a community effort, and we'll talk about that later on. In addition to what I do with Amber Alert and also our nonprofit, I'm also a consultant for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and help out with cases of missing and abducted children in that capacity. So I find a lot to keep me busy, really. So we'll get going with the presentation. But first, what I'd like to do is just do a quick poll question out there for folks. I'd like to know, what profession you're in or line of work. It's important for us to know who's attending our sessions and who's out there and who we're speaking to. So I hope that my presentation will cover all the bases with folks out there, no matter what you do, no matter who you work for. But I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit for everybody by the end of the day. So if you'll quickly just click on which one applies to you, and then we'll go ahead and get going. Okay, it looks like we've got some law. It looks like a pretty good cross-section of folks. Lots of good nonprofits out there. That's good. Okay, we'll go ahead and get going with the presentation. Just wanted to go over some facts and myths regarding sex offenders when we're talking about the public perception Like I said, with Ryan United, we do quite a bit of training out there in the communities, and I don't suggest doing this, after we get off the session or anything, but if you were to walk up to a person on the street and ask them, what do you think a sex offender is? A lot of people are going to go, the first thing that's going to pop into their mind is the worst case scenario, like my brother's killer or Joseph Duncan, who was responsible for taking the 2 kids in Coeur d'Alene, and then, the worst case scenario with, that's what the public perception is. But some of the things that I've got when I have asked that question is, what is your perception of a sex offender? A lot of public will say that sex offenders only target children. Excuse me. And we know that a lot of our offenders that are registered across the country don't target children. They target adults. Some target both. We'll talk about crossover behaviors in a little bit. But one of the myths is that all sex offenders only target children. The other ones that are out there, most victims don't know their offender. In a vast majority of cases that involve child sexual abuse, the abuser is known to the victim. So, and we'll talk about those statistics here in the next slide, but the majority of victims know their offender. That contributes to a lot of things. That contributes to mainly underreporting because those children don't necessarily report about their victimization because of the fact that they know the perpetrator. So that's one thing that contributes to underreporting is the fact or the association between the victim and the offender. Most offenders go back to jail for further crimes against children. We know that is not true. Most offenders go back to jail for non-sex-related crimes. So usually it's a probation violation. Usually it's something else that puts them back in prison. It's not necessarily a reoffense. I don't know if you want to do this later on, but if you Google recidivism rates of sex offenders, you'll see that there's lots of different studies out there. There's lots of mindsets on recidivism involving sex offenders. But the good studies that are out there will indicate that the vast majority don't go back to jail for further crimes against children. It's usually something else non-offense related. So most offenders abduct their victims. We know that a very low percentage of these offenders actually abduct children. And we have that statistic in the next slide, I do believe. There are several types of offenders. Some are more dangerous than others. There's a lot of also, I guess if you want to Google this, Google sex offenders. There's lots of studies out there that try and, figure out typology and that try and put certain offenders in certain categories. We know now by looking at cases and studying offenders that it's real hard to categorize them, but we'll talk about a typology today that is specific with, with offenders, and it's just one typology that the FBI uses, so we'll talk about that typology. 85 to 90% of victims know the offender, so their acquaintance or relative. So again, that contributes to a lot of the underreporting that goes on with children who don't come forward who have been sexually abused. We're seeing those numbers of reports with kids increase because of the amount of awareness that there is now, the amount of education that we do with our children, not only hopefully at home, but in our schools about, telling if they are a victim, knowing that there's a place to go and knowing that they can tell somebody. We talked about recidivism, and only about 5.3 of the people in prison for sex crimes were rearrested on a subsequent sex offense. So those are, that's a pretty low statistic. So most of our offenders go back to prison for different kinds of crimes and not sex-related crimes. About 1% of children were abducted by a sex offender. So about 1% of the cases of involving an abducted children were abducted by a known sex offender. So that stat is very low as well. So that is where my brother's case fits in, is about that 1% case. Just more of what we know. There's no simple answer why people victimize children. I mean, we've looked at a lot of different statistics and a lot of different studies that have been done, and there's just no simple answer for it. A lot of the offenders, we'll talk about their typology in a little bit, but a lot of them engage in crossover behavior. And by what I mean by that is they'll not only victimize boys, but they'll victimize girls as well. So there's that crossover behavior that exists. And we'll talk about fixated child molesters in a little bit and where they fit in with that crossover behavior. Sexual abuse is a learned behavior. They could have conditions early on in their development that contribute to it. The offender who abducted and murdered my brother Ryan, his excuses have always been that he was sexually molested as a child and that his mom would bring home men from the bar and they would sexually abuse him, and that's one of his excuses that why he did what he did. We know that a lot of people that are sexually abused as children grow up to be, functioning folks in the community and don't commit crimes. But it's something maybe that happened in their early development that contributed to that. Problems with self-regulation, problems with self-control or impulse control, that's one reason why they may do it. And bad attitudes towards women, bad attitudes, towards children, whatever it is, could be a contributor as well. So how do we manage offenders? That's one thing that we kind of have to strike a balance on. I've gotten a lot of people that say, well, you should lock them up and throw away the key. Well, we know that doesn't work the way our system is built. However, we do want to find out what it is that we can implement if we are going to let offenders out that don't allow them to slip through the cracks. One of the best, comprehensive studies or publications that was put together was a Sex Offender Management Assessment and Planning Initiative. In 2012, I was part of a group. There was about 50 of us from across the country. We came together in Washington, D.C. at the SMART office, and our mission was really to get together and find out the best evidence-based techniques that work in communities for managing offenders. And we looked at not only adult offenders, but juvenile offenders as well. If you'll go to the SMART website, so it's smart.gov, and you can go to that website, and you can click on this SOMAPI report. Everything has an acronym, but you can click on that report and you can go in there and see the work that was compiled about best practices when it comes to managing offenders and when it comes to dealing with offenders in the community. It's a really thorough document, and the SMART office did a great job putting that together, and it's a great resource for whichever profession you're in, not only law enforcement, but corrections. I see we have some juvenile folks out there that are juvenile justice folks. Great report. It's great it takes a lot. There's a lot of reading in it, but it's very comprehensive. So also multidisciplinary approaches. We've got to have, if we're going to let community or offenders out into our community, we've got to have a multidisciplinary approach when it comes to managing offenders. We've got to have places where they can go. We've got to have programs in place that reduce recidivism. Those are all types of things that we need to have in our community. And it does take community involvement. It takes a community to be able to not only recognize the offenders in the community, but also manage them, having those resources so those offenders don't reoffend. I've been in lots of community meetings where I was just in one about a year ago where they wanted to put in pre-release for sex offenders in a community. And boy, it got a lot of, negative feedback. People didn't want it in the community, and I can see that end of it. But on the other side of the coin, we have to have programs in place where these offenders can go to, because we just don't want them out in the wind. We don't want them to be like the guy that killed my brother with no notification in the community, and we just don't know where they are. Being from Montana, I always use the analogy with folks. It's like having a rattlesnake, or if you were in a dark room and somebody threw in some rattlesnakes with you, would you rather have the lights on or off? I'd rather have them on so I knew where they were, rather than have them off and not know where they were. So that's Same thing when it comes to sex offender management. We need to know where these offenders are, and we need to have programs in place to basically be that safety net in the community. And so consistency also. One of the ways that we've tried to get consistent with sex offender management is the Adam Walsh Act. And Title I of the Adam Walsh Act, which is SORNA, deals with that. It deals with a consistency in the way that we manage offenders, a consistency in the way that we tier level offenders, basically across the board. We know that there's right now there's 16 states that are compliant with SORNA. We've got quite a few left to go, and there's reasons for pushback on that. But it is one way that we can get consistency across the board with dealing with offenders. Personally, through our nonprofit, I've dealt with lots of offenders, or dealt with lots of law enforcement who are looking for offenders that are non-compliant. They're off the grid. So we'll help them with resources to try and locate those offenders. But sometimes the reason they go off the grid is inconsistencies between what states are doing. So it's important that we move towards, as a country, getting that consistency in practice the way we do things. So who are the victims? Who do they target? Mostly we know that offenders choose vulnerable victims for obvious reasons. The more vulnerable the child, the less likely that child is to report it. The more that they can take advantage of that child and use those vulnerabilities against them. Some offenders are opportunistic. They see an opportunity and they take it. They do whatever they do to victimize the child, and they'll describe it as a crime of opportunity. Access, we know that certain offenders will try and get access to victims either through, private clubs or through, different community programs. They'll try and get access to children and try and find that victim that's going to be maybe vulnerable. And also underreporting, I think that contributes to really how we determine how offenders act, how many victims they'll have. So a lot of that underreporting hampers those efforts to determine what offenders, how they'll act, or who they will victimize, or how many victims they'll have. Just a little bit about typology, and this is something that really could be an 8-hour class on just typology of sex offenders, but I'm going to cover it sort of quickly here and just talk about the different type of offenders, and then I'll talk about a couple of different cases that I was directly involved in I'll try and give you an example of each type of offender that we talk about. But there's several theories. Again, if you're bored and you want to go Google sex offenders or sex offender management, you can see a lot of different studies out there. You can see a lot of things that try and define the offender, that try and put those offenders into category. But really a lot of these theories are looking at their behaviors, what type of victims they have, the reasons for reoffending, and their risk of reoffense too. So a lot of studies have been done, but again, keep in mind that none of these they're 100% conclusive. None of them are. So just be cautious with that. The typologies that we'll talk about today are, again, the typologies that the FBI uses. Their behavioral science folks came up with these typologies, and they've been around for a long time and seem to be the most, I guess, accurate or the most, they contain the most information. But if you want to Google this, again, you'll see a lot about this typology that we're going to talk about now. But a regressed child molester is somebody that does not have a primary sexual interest in children. In other words, their true sexual interest isn't in children. If you were to sit down and talk with one of these offenders and you asked them about their relationship, they would describe a normal relationship with the opposite sex. Their true sexual interest is not with children. They experiment with children for a lot of different reasons, maybe because the child is vulnerable, maybe because they're stressed, introduced into their life. They'll experiment with children. They usually have the fewest number of victims, but they're, again, with underreporting, because usually they target vulnerable victims. With underreporting, they may have more victims. A lot of the sex offender studies that are done, a lot of that involve offenders, and we'll talk about a Butner state or federal prison study here in a minute, but they directly involve offenders. And with some of those studies, they're using things like polygraph and interviews to get the accurate number of victims that these offenders actually have. So, you know, again, they may have the fewest number of victims, but again, underreporting contributes to that as well. So just a case study. This is a case I was directly involved in when I was with the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation. This guy was a karate coach. He was big into the community. A lot of people liked him. He set up a karate center for kids to come in, and of course they would learn karate, and he was the instructor. He had a few other instructors that worked there as well. But he developed a relationship with the single mother of a 14-year-old girl. Pretty soon he would start keeping this 14-year-old girl after practice. He would start bringing her gifts, giving her things, but basically kind of taking her and isolating her from the rest of the class to give her special treatment. The mom, being single, she thinks that the karate coach likes her, and she thinks that they're an item. Well, this 14-year-old girl went to school and disclosed to a school counselor that on four different occasions this girl had had inappropriate sexual contact with this karate coach. She discloses it to the counselor. The counselor, of course, reports it, and then the investigation begins. Law enforcement agency that investigated it, they went immediately to talk to the coach, and of course he denied it. The 14-year-old girl was forensically interviewed. She was also forensically examined, and they were able to get evidence from both the interview and the exam that this had occurred. So he was arrested on that. He was released on his own recognizance after the initial appearance was made. So he was arrested. Spent a couple days in jail, went up to see the judge. The judge said, okay, I'm going to release you. Just make sure you don't leave town, don't have any contacts with the victim, that kind of thing. Well, he immediately got out of jail and starts contacting the mother of this 14-year-old girl with threats. So the threats go on. He contacts the daughter via her cell phone with threats as well. And then they report that. He's rearrested and bonds out. So he goes to see the judge again. He gets out of jail again and immediately solicits the girl via text message to run off with him and to go and be with him. So he was arrested again, and that time he stayed in jail. But that kind of, so he fits into that regressed child molester category. I always refer to a regressed child molester as a wolf in sheep's clothing. So basically, on the outside, it may appear that they're not what they are, or it may appear that there's no way in the world that this person would ever do anything like this, but they've got another side to them. So that's what I always refer to when I talk about regressed child molesters. And by the way, just a fact here, and anybody know the difference between a child molester and a pedophile? You see, like the media will use pedophile. Child molester, what makes a pedophile a child molester is when they act out on they go the step further and they assault that child. You can be a pedophile without being a child molester. The definition of a pedophile is just somebody that has a love interest in children. So you could be a pedophile and not be a child molester. You could be a child molester and not be a pedophile. So those are two terms that, I guess just for a fun fact, those are two terms that, like the media will use pedophile a lot. That really doesn't mean that person has molested a child. What makes them a child molester is that overt act of assaulting the child. So that's just a little quick case study on a regressed offender. The second type is fixated child molester. So this type of molester is different because they prefer children. They look to children as providers personal and sexual gratification. They seek out children, and they don't have an interest in any other relationship other than having that with a child. The guy who killed my brother fits into this. He didn't ever have any interest in adults. It was always children with him. And he started at a very young age. He started at 11 years old. This is documented stuff that we've been able to look at. He started at 11 years old. His first victim was a 3-year-old child. His second offense that we know of, he was 14, and his victim was a 2-year-old child. Then again, he at 16 molested a 3-year-old child, and then at 17, he committed a crime against a 4-year-old child, and then when he was 20, he committed that crime against the boy, the 13-year-old boy. Then that one, he was put into our Montana State Prison because obviously he was an adult over the age of 18. So all of his crimes have been against children. No adults throughout his whole offending time. But fixated molesters, they're different because they do fixate on children. This is another case I was involved in 2006 here in Montana, and I was an agent at the time, and I was requested by the local agency to go in. Actually, I was in my office minding my own business, and my boss told me I had to go on this case. So this was a janitor. He had been in a facility for disabled children, so children with developmental disabilities. This is a center that houses those children, and he was the janitor there, so he would be in charge of cleaning up the pods. The housing areas that they would live in, these children would live in, were called pods. So he would go in and clean. Well, one of his victims came forward. This boy was 14 years old. He suffered from mildly disabled, but still enough that he had to be at that facility. But he came forward to his to the social worker there and said that this Richard Peterson would come in at night to these pods, and he would take down his pants and he would masturbate in front of the kids. And sometimes he would make the children do it to him. So this boy reported that, and obviously the social worker took a report, and he reported it to the sheriff's office. They went and interviewed Dick Peterson, and he basically said, no, I didn't do that. That's not something I would do. These kids don't know what they're talking about. He basically described the fact that these kids, were always trying to set him up. We got involved in the case. I interviewed the victim, the 14-year-old boy who was developmentally disabled, and I have to say that if it would have made it to court, this case would have made it to court, that kid would have been a wonderful witness. It was a time in my career where I underestimated what a victim could do based on his disabilities, because I didn't think that he would be able to tell the story. And he not only told the story, but he was very consistent with his story and what happened. I interviewed him, and then I got into the interview with Dick Peterson. Come to find out, by the end of our interview, he had admitted to 14 different kids that he'd sexually molested in the time that he was there for 20-some years that he was the janitor. All children, all under the age of 16. His oldest victim, I think, was 15 years old that he admitted to. Could there have possibly been other victims? Definitely. But he was an example of a fixated child molester. He preferred children. He didn't. He was never a married man. He preferred relationships with children. So Dick was arrested. He was put into jail. He went up to see the judge, and the judge known him for a long time, and said, well, don't go anywhere. Just stick around till your trial, and everything will be fine. We'll get through this. And Dick drove home and put his car in the garage and shut the door and didn't shut the engine off. So Dick passed away that way. So anyway, but he's an example of a fixated child molester. Again, now there's this new type of offender that's out there that isn't included in a lot of studies because it's relatively new, the internet offender. It's a new type of offender. I always say that now we're not looking at the boogeyman behind the bush, we're looking at the boogeyman behind the keyboard. And a lot of our offenders are turning to technology to not only look for children, but also manipulate children. I was just involved a couple weeks ago in a child abduction here in Montana, where we issued an Amber Alert for a 16-year-old girl who was taken by an acquaintance of her mom and dad's. That case, that's how he basically lured her, is through the internet, through Facebook and messaging her, and knew that she was vulnerable. This girl suffered from some developmental disabilities, and that's the way he knew that. So, and luckily we were able to catch up with him in Casper, Wyoming, and he was arrested. But a lot of those offenders will look to the internet to normalize what they do. Pedophilia, there's several different, and again, I don't recommend that you do this, or please don't do it, but there's several different sites out there that pedophiles or child molesters can go on and chat with each other. So that group feeling kind of normalizes it for them, so they think it's okay. Whereas before, without technology, we couldn't really do that. I mean, you couldn't get online and talk to a bunch of other people that, have your same affliction. So that's really starting to normalize it, and they can voice that with other people. Enhanced status with other offenders. I work a lot with our Internet Crimes Against Children task forces, and they all uncover things on the internet where, they're trading videos, and who's ever got the worst video of a child being sexually molested, wins. It's like a contest for them. It's a good grooming environment. All the social media and things like that, they can use that to groom children. They don't have to be who they say they are. Usually I have a picture up here of a fat guy sitting behind the keyboard, but they can basically be something that they're not and entice those children that way. And avoid justice. We know with working with Internet Crimes Against Children task forces around the country, we know that these are hard cases, and they're really just getting to the tip of the iceberg on a lot of them because there's a lot of stuff going on out there. When I talk to ICAC guys that are out there and gals that are out there working these cases, they're saying that they're seeing so much, and they're just able to get to a little bit of it. And my fear is that we're not even seeing some of the stuff that's being done as far as child victimization online. The Internet Offender, this is the Butner Federal Prison Study that I was talking about earlier that was done in 2006 by Dr. Mike Burke. Dr. Burke is he's the lead psychologist for the U.S. Marshal's Office, and he did this study in 2006, and what he was looking for is that correlation between pornography offenders, child pornography offenders, and hands-on offenses. What he wanted to see is there a correlation? So he took 155 men, and they were all men in this study, from the Butner Federal Prison, and basically all these men said, I was put in here just because I had images of child pornography. I've never committed a hands-on offense. So he started this study, and he started using things like the polygraph and real pointed interviews, and then by the end of this study, 85% of them had admitted, just flat out admitted, yeah, not only did I have images, but I've molested children in the past too. 13% of them denied, no, I still haven't done it, but then when he polygraphed them, they failed the polygraph, and then they ended up coming forward and saying yes. There's only 2% in that study that could honestly say that they had never sexually molested victims, but they were looking for a chance. So one thing that we have to start doing is we have to start convincing, and I see it a lot in judges, that these are crime scene photos. These are child pornography are photos of children being sexually abused, and they're actual crime scene photos. We need to start convincing, and I'll say judges again, I don't want to pick on judges, but there's a high correlation between collecting pornography and hands-on offenses. Just some stats here, and I don't like to bore people with a lot of statistics, but during this 2005 study that the National Center did and OJJDP did, when they looked at these offenders who were just, again, in jail for just having images of children, 83 of them had images of children 6 to 12, 39% had images of children 3 to 5 years old, and 19% had images of children 3 years and younger. Another thing that they found is 80% of these images of children that they had images of sexual penetration. 21% had images of children subject to bondage, rape, or torture, so just the worst of the worst that you can think of. 21% had in their possession. Law enforcement, when we talk about internet crimes against children, we know that the victims are getting younger. Many of these victims are babies or toddlers. The abuse is getting more violent and sadistic, and there's more streaming video that's going on. So they're distributing these videos of these children basically being tortured. The other thing that we're finding out, and this is not only law enforcement saying this, but also corrections, our juvenile folks are saying that our offenders are getting younger too. We're starting to see more offenders start to offend at very young ages. There's many states that are looking at that and starting to create programs for those children that are offenders. And it's something that we're a little bit behind on. I don't know if there's anybody out there from Oregon, but you guys have a pretty good comprehensive program on dealing with juvenile offenders, and I think it's probably one of the best in the country. But there's several states that are working on it. There's other states that probably have things stood up, but we are starting to see our offenders get a lot younger as well. Again, with the high correlation of abuse to having images, 40% of these offenders were actively molesting at the time that they were caught, and 15% of those were attempting to victimize a child. So at their arrest, the day of their arrest, 55% of these offenders were an active danger to children. So that correlation is important to understand. Get to know your ICAC task force. Again, there's 61 task forces throughout the country. And so get to know your commander, get to know who your ICAC folks are. They do an incredible job of uncovering these horrific cases against our children online. They're a great resource if you need, you're doing an investigation for law enforcement folks out there, or anybody doing an investigation and you need some help with technology. Definitely get a hold of your ICAC folks because they do a good job and they're a good resource. Again, there's one in each state. Some states have more than one, but again, a great resource. Reoffense, we talk about reoffense. Why did they reoffend? Again, this goes back to, what do we have in the community that's going to help these offenders not to reoffend? And I've been told several times that, why are you advocating for offenders in the community? I'm not advocating for them in the community, but our system puts them back into the community. So we need programs that hold them accountable and make sure that they've got some safety net to fall into. A lot of stressors that offenders will say contribute to that are obviously homelessness, unemployment, lack of mental health treatment. So they can't get services on the outside, so they're only comfortable on the inside. One way to get back inside is to reoffend. So my point being is that we've got to have a community approach to it. We have to make sure that there's things in place for these offenders so they don't reoffend. Because, if they're unmonitored, they're going to be unaccountable. Protecting communities, again, knowledge is power. Knowing that, involving your community. Make sure that, you involve your community in the process. A lot of times, communities, again, will have these perceptions about what sex offenders are and what they aren't. And it's important that our community knows that there's a difference between not every offender is like the guy that killed my brother. And thank God they're not, because if they were, we'd all be very, very busy. But, get your communities to know your sex offender registry. Show them where it's at, how to use it. That's very key in protecting the community. Sex offender registries, again, the National Sex Offender Public website, NSOPW, that's ran again by the U.S. Department of Justice Smart Office, and it's a good resource, but it takes everybody's information from all states, and you can search in any state for an offender. It's a good resource. It's something that's pretty useful to folks if they want to go and search an offender by name, address, or whatever, however they want to search it. I know that we've found offenders that have been in other states that are missing from, we just had one from Montana that was missing. We ended up finding him in Colorado using the National Sex Offender Public website. But, involving the community is very, very important. So make sure that they're a part of it too. Well, I've talked a lot. Now it's time to maybe hear from you. So I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, thanks, Derek, for that presentation. I just wanted to remind our listeners to continue to submit their questions in the Q&A box as we begin this Q&A portion of the presentation. And so one of my first questions for you, Derek, was in regards to your brother's disappearance and during the investigation. Could you share more about what eventually led law enforcement to look at the offender and kind of provide more information in regards to the investigation aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. When my brother when he went missing, he just simply disappeared, and at that time, law enforcement's response was fairly slow, and they just figured, well, he's an 8-year-old boy. My mom lived right on a creek she had a creek behind her house, so they're like, he just went off. It's the last day of summer. He's out playing somewhere. But after about 6 hours, then the first officer arrived on the scene, and that's when they started taking it very seriously that, he was actually missing. So they started to search for him, and the search continued throughout that first night and into the second day. Well, the morning of the second day, a probation officer from a neighboring community about 90 miles away got into his car, and he turned it on. He said, the first thing I heard was the bulletin for your brother that, your brother was missing, and that, anybody with information needed to call the sheriff's office. Well, what had happened is he immediately thought of Robert Hornback, the guy that was responsible for taking and murdering my brother. He knew that Robert Hornback was released into that community about 90 days before. So that probation officer drove to the sheriff's office, and he went in and talked to the sheriff, Ray Nixon at the time, and he said, Sheriff, he says, if you have a missing boy, we need to find Robert Hornback. We need to find out where he's at. So with that, they drove over to Robert Hornback's mother's house where he was living at the time. They did a probationary search because, remember, he had just gotten out of prison. And they were able to find not only his bloody clothing, but a shirt that my brother was wearing at the time. So that's really what led them to this perpetrator. That's what they knew that this guy was in town. They also knew that, before he left the Montana State Prison, he said to the prison psychologist, he said, if you release me into the community, not only will I victimize another child, but this time I'm going to kill my victim and I'm going to leave no witnesses. So they knew that he would probably, if he was in the community and there was a missing 8-year-old boy, that he probably had something to do with it.
Thanks, Dirk, for sharing that. So our next question is, what recommendations do you have for enhancing the relationship between, a therapist and law enforcement to prevent, to work together and prevent sexual offenses?
Yeah, it's important, back to that multidisciplinary approach. I think it's important to have not only local discussions about it, but I think that needs to rise to a state level. I look at the state of Colorado, and I think the state of Illinois as well. They have sex offender management boards, which really is at a state level. They're non-political boards, but really they handle all aspects of sex offender management. And it's really effective because then I think you get those relationships that are built that can help manage offenders in the community. Here in Montana, we're doing a reentry initiative and it has to do with all offenders, but a specific part of that has to do with sex offenders and how you bring them into the community and how you manage them properly. So I think the more that folks can work on that multidisciplinary approach, the better off it's going to be, and the more they're going to be able to be successful with managing offenders in the community.
And so, Derek, I know you talked a little bit about getting the community involved and having those discussions. Can you provide more specifics in regards to maybe who should be in the room when these community discussions are going on, and what would be some first priorities or considerations, or maybe a community that hasn't really maybe taken the steps necessary to address managing sex offenders within their jurisdiction?
Yeah, I think folks that should come to the table, obviously, the first, folks that I see that should be there are corrections people, and that has to do with both corrections on the inside of prison and on the outside, being probation, because really when you think about it, those folks they're in touch with these offenders a lot. They know basically how they act. They know what they can and can't do. They know a lot about the offenders. So I think first and foremost, corrections both in and out of the prison is very important. Also, law enforcement, obviously, they're going to need to be involved. Mental health providers, treatment providers, sex offender treatment providers. We've got a sex offender treatment association here in Montana who I speak to in a couple weeks, and they're a crucial part of that whole equation because, again, they work every day with these offenders, and they know they'll tell you what offender is probably more likely to reoffend. And so having those folks at the table and really, beginning by just flushing out what the problem is. Are there offenders in the community? What's the community perception of that? And what can be done to sort of educate the community about what offenders are and what they aren't? Our reentry initiative here in Montana, we did a series of news stories on basically, what is reentry and how can you put an offender in a community and be safe? So those are things that we address. So getting, your media involved, and because it's going to be a hot button topic, but getting, just whoever can bring resources to the table and who is a good representative for, for their agency to do that. Because not everybody in corrections wants to deal with sex offenders. Not everybody in law enforcement wants to deal with it. So having that person that's going to be there and going to be consistent to get that conversation going.
Thank you. So our next question is in regards to cases or reports of missing children and suggestions that you may have, not just for maybe law enforcement, but from all different disciplines in regards to strategies that they could do to perhaps help the family in the area of identifying maybe possible sex offenders in the local area. So kind of more so the investigation and how this all ties into missing and abducted children. Well,
we know percentage-wise, and I shared that with you, that not a lot of child molesters are going to abduct their victims. It's pretty rare. But yet, when it comes to missing children, we have to make sure that we've got a fast, thorough approach to missing kids. And part of that, and we distribute a lot through the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program, we give out first responder checklists when a child's missing or a child's been abducted. We give that first responder a checklist, and part of that on there is identifying all the sex offenders in the area. A perfect way to do that, if you have a missing child case, a perfect way to do that is get a hold of your corrections folks, get a hold of your probation, because they will know where these offenders are. Not only will they know where they are, but they will be able to interview. You're going to have somebody when that child is missing, you're going to have somebody that will go out and not only account for these offenders, but also interview them. That became crucial in the Jessica Lunsford case, with the ability to find where the offenders were and also to interview them. John Cooey, as you know, who is responsible for Jessica's abduction and murder, he was at that house. He was an offender who was not compliant. So knowing that information and knowing where your offenders are, and also, when you're doing that canvas, that door-to-door search, making sure that you have identified everybody in the house that could possibly be there. And that, again, back to the Jessica Lunsford case, that was somebody that they discovered later on that was living there was John Cooey. He was living with relatives at the time. So those things are very important, you know, when it comes to these missing children cases, that we do identify these offenders in the community, and we know where they're at, and we've accounted for them as well.
Thanks, Derek. So that wraps up our questions for this webinar. So I just want to thank you, Derek, for providing your insight and responding to our audience's questions.
Absolutely.
So before we close, I'd like to thank all of our participants for being a part of today's webinar, and give a special thanks to Derek for joining us. Future webinar announcements from our Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance program will be made in the coming weeks. And for those of you who are interested in the PowerPoint or any presenter bio information, please find that information in your handout section on your screen. So at this time, Carissa, I'll turn the presentation back to you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd like to also thank Derek for a great discussion on the topic. We have just a few brief reminders. This webinar will be archived in OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. For more information, please contact OJJDP NTTAC or Fox Valley Technical College. And lastly, please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.